Welcome to video 3. In this video, we will talk about how to make and use a schedule. So what we're doing here is putting together what we've learned so far. So we've already talked about identifying the benefits of time management strategies, describing effective time management strategies, and now we'll talk about how you can use those effective strategies specifically to create a weekly schedule, which is the time management skill we're going to focus on developing throughout this semester. So in this video, we'll talk about specifically how to make and use that schedule. So we'll start with how to make a schedule. And the first thing you'll need to decide, if you haven't done so already, is what type of planner or schedule you're going to use. So some people prefer a paper planner. You can buy one at the Sac State bookstore for about $10. Other people prefer a digital planner, which is what I personally use. I really like Google Calendar, but there are other things like iCal as well. And so you'll have to decide which one you'll want to use. Google Calendar has some benefits, like it can integrate with your Canvas calendar. But again, I do recognize some people like the hard paper copy. So either one's fine. When you're filling in your schedule, the first thing you'll need to do is start with your unmovable items. So things that you don't have control over when they happen, right? So this is things like classes, which are shown here in this image, or things like work. So here's an example. This is another one of the slides that Commit to Study graciously shared with me. And there are some examples on the left of things that are considered immovable or non-negotiable items that go in our schedule first. So the first thing is things like classes, right? You know when those are throughout the week. Those are shown in yellow. You can add those in. Another note is that color coding things, using different colors for different types of tasks, can be helpful when you're doing your schedule as well. The next thing you might want to add in is your job. So those, again, your shifts are non-negotiable. You have to be at work when you have to be at work, so you can add that in. And the next two items, things like sleep and exercise, I'm putting those on the non-negotiable list because I think it's really important for us to make sure we're taking care of ourselves. So as I mentioned earlier, my goal in teaching you all how to use these time management skills is not only for academic success, but also to be a happier, healthier person. And so things like getting the right amount of sleep, so I put that in the schedule. Planning time for exercise, which is also really important for our mental health and just helping us be happier and healthier. Those are things that I would suggest also putting in your schedule as non-negotiables to make sure you make the time to take care of yourself. After we have all those non-negotiables filled in, then we want to fill in our high priority items. And the way that we can decide whether an item is considered high priority is not is based on a couple different factors. So it can be based on the urgency of the item. So whether it's when the due date is, for example, if the due date is tomorrow or if it's in a week. And the other high priority way to determine if something is high priority or not is the impact. So the impact that item is going to have, whether you do it or not. So some examples of academic high priority items could be things like I mentioned earlier, the deadline is due tomorrow, but also things can be high priority if the impact is high. So for example, it's a big project that's worth a large portion of your grade. Even if that thing isn't due for another 2 or 3 weeks, you know you have to start it early, right? With breaking it down to the smaller tasks like we talked about. So even if the due date isn't necessarily tomorrow, it can still be a high priority item if that impact is high. So if we look here in this chart, the high priority items are where the urgency and impact are all medium to high. So those are the things you'll want to fill into your schedule first to make sure you give yourself enough time to accomplish those tasks. A couple of reminders based on things we've talked about before. When you're filling in items in your schedule, make sure you're being very specific. So instead of saying study for Bio 1, you want to say something like do first 5 problems of problem set 1 or something like that. So you have a very specific task that you need to accomplish. Another thing to consider when you're filling in these items into your schedule in terms of when to put them, make sure you're considering when your brain works best. So what I'm showing here are 4 images of what are called 4 different different people have different opinions about how many different types there are, but these are different chronotypes. So a chronotype is something, there's scientific evidence for this. It's based on people's different body rhythms. So it's related to circadian rhythms, but it's not quite the same thing. But your chronotype is largely determined genetically, and it affects when you are most productive, when your brain works best. So me, for example, I am most productive in the morning. And so when I'm working out my schedule, I put my most important, most mentally challenging tasks at the beginning of the day, because I know that's when my brain works best. But other people are completely the opposite. Other people work best at night or in the evening. And so make sure you take that into account when you're thinking about when to put these different items in your schedule. Make sure that you're putting your hardest, most important tasks during a time in the day when your brain is going to be the best able to accomplish that task. Also remember to give yourself a buffer like we've talked about before. So if you think something's going to take you an hour, give yourself an hour and a half to do it, so you have that 50% buffer. So as an example here, some high priority items could be, again, returning to that example we used in a previous video with breaking down the bio poster project into different specific tasks. Maybe we need to start doing the rough draft. So we'll put in our schedule that we need to do 2 different sections of that project, the result and the methods. And so we put those, so if I were doing this, for example, I would put these tasks at a time when I know my brain works best in the morning before 12 a.m. And say I thought that each of these might take me an hour and a half. I'm going to give myself 2 hours as a buffer. And I'm also going to specifically say I am going to go to the library so I can do these tasks. So we're setting ourselves up for specific locations and distraction-free zones, so we have a plan to help us succeed. After we've done the high priority items, then we want to fill in the medium and low priority items. And those are things that either the urgency and or the impact is not as high. So low priority item, for example, is maybe something that doesn't absolutely have to get done today. It could be pushed till tomorrow if absolutely necessary, but we want to try and put it in our schedule today if we can. So an example of that might be like I put here in gray. So maybe we have a chem problem set that isn't due for a week. So it's best if we get started now so we can put in our schedule to do the first 5 questions of the chem problem set. Another item we could put in that's less of a priority because of the impact is reading for our Wednesday lecture. And it's also important, like we talked about before, put in those 30-minute buffer blocks throughout the day to give you some time if you need it. So you can add in, use that time for things like checking your email or kind of dealing with issues as they arise if unexpected things come up that you need to get done. If you'd forgotten about an assignment, which hopefully you won't do now with your handy dandy schedule, but it gives you some flexibility. Or maybe it takes you longer than usual that day to get to class because there's traffic. Those buffer times can be helpful for that. So some things to consider when we're talking about making our schedule. Per Sac State campus policy, you should be budgeting about 2 to 3 hours of study time per unit per week. So what that means is that a 3-unit lecture class, you should be putting about 9 hours of study time in your schedule for that particular class. Remember, we want to be specific in terms of, we don't just want to put study time in our schedule. We want to say read chapter 1 or do first 5 problems of problem set or review Tuesday lecture notes or something like that. We always want to be specific, but overall per week, outside of class, for a 3-unit class, we should be budgeting about 9 hours of study time per week. Also, when you're thinking about your schedule, include time in your schedule for making your schedule. So this does take a little bit of time. And this is kind of like schedule inception. You're scheduling time to make your schedule, but this is something that I do every week. I call it my weekly meeting. I usually do it Friday afternoon so I can look at the upcoming week and make sure I have everything in my schedule that I need to for the following week. But make sure you're giving yourself enough time to do that and set yourself up for success. And also recognize that this is a process. So like we've talked about a little bit before, ideally everything will be perfect and go in line, but sometimes in reality, sorry you can't see this, my face is blocking this, it says reality, things can be a little bit more challenging than maybe we would hope or expect. So for me, for example, when I started doing a schedule and doing time boxing and putting things in specific times every day, I realized I had more things than I had time for in a day. And so that might be something that you realize too. And so you won't necessarily be able to fix that immediately, but as you recognize it and you do your schedule week after week throughout the semester, you can start to adjust and, for example, say no to more commitments and that kind of thing. But over time, through this process of developing your time management skills, you can get better at it and make a schedule that's more manageable and healthy for you. So how to use your schedule after you've made it. One thing you want to do is review it every day. So I, for example, like to review my schedule at the end of the day to have a preview for the next day. And then I also do that at the beginning of the day. And when we're reviewing, one of the things we want to look at is make sure that all the priority items we've put in there don't need to be adjusted. So is there anything that you had put as low priority on a later day that now you need to adjust and move it to this day? Those are some of the things we're looking at as we review our schedule. And then check off your completed tasks, right? So either that can be a physical check mark, a Google Calendar. You can click that task completed. As an aside, one of the things I like about Google Calendar is that you can put things in specific blocks of time each day, but you also can have a to-do list at the top. And if you, at the top of each day, and if you don't complete that task automatically rolls over to your next day. So it will be easy for you to recognize that you haven't completed that task yet. So revisiting our learning objectives, we've talked about now this third one. So now we've talked about how to use these concrete strategies to actually create a weekly schedule for you that you can use every week. That'll give you a nice idea of what you have to do for each of your different classes, your work, self-care, family, that kind of thing.